I'm doing what we call wattle fencing, which is something people brought here from home. They had done it for many years in England. Wattling is really just saplings which are woven through a structure of other saplings. And it's an old way of fencing animals out, which is their concept of fencing. They didn't fence animals in so much as out. So pigs and chickens would be kept out of the kitchen garden, which I'm fencing. After the establishment of tobacco as a primary economy, the English began to come here. And of course they brought their people, but also their small economies and their culture. So that's why you see English kitchen gardens in Virginia. They realized that the gold that they had found was not the nugget gold, but the soil. And of course it could grow the tobacco and it could grow many other things. So their vegetables and their fruits and other things began to come. This is in the late period of the teens, 16 teens. So by the time that first General Assembly is happening, you've got 20 what they call plantations in their language, that are small farms which primarily grow tobacco, but they all have kitchen gardens, they all have what we call cattle, which is any hoofed animal, and they're beginning the process of making a new England, even though they don't call it that quite yet.
The dawn of the 17th century witnessed the great powers of Europe scrambling for control of the Americas. Several Spanish colonies had been established, but England struggled to gain a foothold. In 1606, King James granted a charter to the Virginia Company of London. The private enterprise hoped to plant an English colony in the New World, turning a handsome profit for its shareholders. Ultimately, however, nations and companies didn't undertake the dangerous, lonely, and backbreaking work of settling an unknown continent. People did.
You would have to be someone who is adventurous, well, either adventurous or desperate, simply because you're leaving everything that you know, society as you know it, the world as you know it, and you're going to get on a boat and go for 6 months across an ocean where you have obviously never been, to an area that you know nothing about except what has come back to you. And of course, with the Virginia Company, when they advertised Virginia to entice people to come, come to Virginia. There's gold to be found, tobacco. It's just a land of plenty. Come get it. Of course they're going to tell you that. And if you're smart enough, you're going to realize, of course they're going to tell me that. So you really had to be brave and adventurous. And then you had the other end of it, which was the group that had no other options. You have second and third sons who by English law would inherit nothing from their estates. So if they weren't well educated and did not have a station chosen for them, or were not apprenticed out to learn a trade, you had nothing. And English society was very, very strict. You were born into your social class, and very rarely did you get out of the station that you were born into. So this was an opportunity. They took the chance. They were going to make it here.
The idea was a good one. They thought, going away to Eden, and the PR and the plays and the poems and things that were written to encourage them to do that. But they also thought that there were monsters in the ocean. The maps actually showed the monsters, so you knew they were there. And that they were cut out from the depths and hauled down the ship and so on. So they went in fear all the way. And then they'd also heard that there were tigers, there were Indians, savages with 3-inch teeth, and they didn't know what to expect. So when you land and you say, what's out there, Are there great big people, little tiny people, And what sort of animals are going to eat us? You really lived in fear. It took a while to settle down. But what you settled into was, oh my God, this is it? Where do we go from here? Can we go home? Oh no, sir, not you.
The first colonists were employees of the Virginia Company. Many had passage paid by others, becoming indentured servants and working their lands for several years before receiving property of their own.
I think most of them were anywhere from about 16 to to about 20, 21. Some may have been older than that. But they were looking for young people who were looking for making their way. And of course, no one knew at the time, but sometimes as much as 7 out of 10 of these people would die before they even got their freedom. But you could come here and in 5 to 7 years of an indenture, learn the skill of growing tobacco, become free of service again, and establish yourself as a small farmer. And then you could marry, and then you could start the life that you would have at home with some opportunity here in Virginia, with a lot of risk, of course, too.
If you don't know that you're missing electricity, if you don't know that you're missing running water, if you are used to taking a sponge bath once or twice a week and taking a full bath once a month and only washing your hair twice a year, if you are used to not having running water and no toilets and no kitchen with running water, no refrigeration, then you would know that you're missing it. But that's how they lived. They had none of these conveniences whatsoever. And it was hard, especially the first colonists. And they left a life of civilization in England, civilized society, and came here. And they had nothing.
If you wanted water to wash your clothes or your dishes, you did have to take a hike down to the river and bring your water back. No running water, no electricity, no indoor bathrooms, but that was how life was, and you learned to live with it and you worked with it.
It is a lot harder than we think. Physical labor, a lot of boredom, and of course the danger of what's outside. There is always someone who wants to kill you when you're here in the 16 teens. But people in England, in the rural culture, and almost everything there is rural, the people who came here were used to hard manual labor. And many of them worked harder than many of us could imagine, I think. And they knew what they were doing by the time they were 20 years old. They'd worked on the farm since they were little people. And so they had a fair idea of a good day's work and how to do the types of things that they were indentured to do, if they were indentured servants, or if they were other people who were not indentured, that skill.
Life on the Virginia frontier was rugged, dirty, and dangerous, a reality that often eludes modern perceptions of colonial life.
People have this idea of the colonial era. It's gorgeous, it's beautiful. There are big houses and carriages and the clothing and the lace and the hair. The hair always gets people with all the curls and the wigs and the furniture. I mean, we look at furniture like this today and we think, it's spectacular, it's wonderful. You know, we're impressed by it because it's an antique. We look at portraits and we think, oh, where they lived, we'd look at menus and all those sorts of things where we have this idea that it was all beautiful all the time. And you know, you're stepping 200 years later and you're looking from the outside in, and they forget things like they had no electricity, they had no running water, their kitchens were outside, they had no bathrooms inside, there were outhouses, there were chamber pots, you know, that you would use in the middle of the night. They had illnesses. I mean, the Tidewater region was especially prone to illnesses, typhoid, malaria, you name it. Family members died all the time. It was a great frequency. I mean, children were lucky to make it through a birth, let alone the first 2 to 3 years. I mean, 1 in 5 children statistically in the 17th century died before they reached the age of 5.
The other concept that modern Americans seem to have is right away everyone was trying to break away from the monarchy and English society, and it took a couple of centuries to come to that. The colonists saw themselves as English, and frequently in the primary documents we see the native people here referred to as the Virginians.
The Virginia Company is basically telling the Englishmen to rely on the Indians for things such as different types of food, the corn, of course, the deer meat. They're not sending over hunters. They're not sending over farmers in the beginning. So they're supposed to rely on the Indians for trade, for foods. Of course, the English have wonderful toys, you know, metal tools and blue glass beads and these items that really intrigue the Indians. It's not the first time they've seen these items. They've seen several Europeans going up and down river for years now. It just so happens that they're actually in vicinity to actually, you know, to get their hands onto these items. It's not that they're necessary, The Powhatans have wonderful tools made of stone and bone and shell and wood and even fire as a wonderful technology source. But it is a matter of wanting. And these nice, shiny, or even pretty, or even extremely sharp objects. Something you don't have to make for once, something that might actually last a little bit longer than your tool, intrigues them very much.
During this period of history, Englishmen and other Europeans had a theory of improvement. And a lot of times the English who came here thought that it was their destiny to improve the land, to change it from the purpose that it had been used for in the past. So in many cases, people saw the Native Americans as being a nuisance because the Native Americans were already settled here and needed to be moved out of the way. On the other hand, they certainly were considered to be worthy opponents, and they were relied upon for a long period of time for the food that was here. And definitely the early settlements would not have been successful without trading and barter with the Native Americans.
The commodities, basically, that they were getting from the Indians, of course, you know, the Virginia Company is heavily relying on these men to send back commodities to to pay their way for their trip over. And some of those commodities that they get from the Virginia Indians happen to be things like furs. Of course, beaver fur will become probably one of the most important ones, just because beaver felt is extremely expensive, if you will. It's water repellent. It's also a lot softer than the wool felt that's being made over in England. It's not as itchy and scratchy. As far as the rarities were concerned, things like the raccoon and the opossum, if you will, two of the Powhatan words that we have still kept to this day. These animals did not exist over in England, so taking something like one of these raccoons or one of these possums back to England and showing them, you know, this is what I found, you know, to your royal court, it's like giving them a gift that they could not ever receive in their own country. And we do know for a fact that they did that. We do know that royalty liked to see these rare things. We also know that such things as the wood, the hardwoods, there's a major hardwood shortage over in England at this time. So taking these trees that we have, which of course you have to imagine them being probably about 3 to 4 times the size that they are now, and extreme good hardwoods to make beautiful furniture with, or even shipbuilding also. It ends up being a really good commodity in the New World as well.
The dream of easy riches died quickly for the shareholders of the Virginia Company. Gradually, the first settlers came to realize that the land itself offered opportunities for wealth. But profits had to take a backseat to the simple act of survival, which demanded more time and effort than anyone could have imagined.
They were as prepared as they could be. They thought they were very well prepared, but there were things that happened that they had not anticipated. They did not find the gold and jewels right away, and they weren't quite prepared for that. They underestimated how often it would they would have to be resupplied from England in order to sustain a first effort, and that created a lot of problems early on.
The goods weren't coming back, and there wasn't any gold, there wasn't any silver. Nothing was sustained, because everything relied on ships that came in to replace colonists who died off and so on. There was no real continuum, except a flow of instructions from London. To do this, do that, do the other, hold your own, and if you can manage it, Christianize the savages. There'll be a tremendous turnover. So the first families of Virginia sort of crept in here a little later, which was lucky because they can't be blamed for all the atrocities that were wrought in the first year or two.
Death was a constant companion for the colonists. Disease and starvation took a tremendous toll, pushing the colony to the brink of collapse. Thanks to tenacity, stubbornness, or maybe even greed, the colony persevered.
They were English people, you know, they were Englishmen, English women. That's who they were. That was their identity. And there was no concept of, you know, you're going to come here and live in a log cabin for the rest of your life and eat bugs, you know, or spin your own fabric. And that was not their goal. The goal was to eventually sort of establish an extension of England. And that's what they did. And yes, it did afford more opportunities for those who didn't have opportunity in England. So yes, in a sense, you get to make your own destiny. But at the same time, you were still confined by social structures as you know, the colony progressed.
I think they just transported themselves to a new world with their world attached. And they had to have some of that. That foundation had to come with them. It was like being on the moon, is what I call it.
When you need something, you need it, and you're not going to get it from England today or tomorrow. It's going to take a while.
The one thing I think that I've learned doing all this as an interpreter is that life in the past is much, much slower than it is today and requires more patience. To do a wattle fence will probably take 2 or 3 weeks. I'd like to have it done in a couple days, but that isn't going to happen. And to do something well, I think, to them, probably meant more than to do it quickly. That was where they came from.
In 1611, with Jamestown struggling, the Virginia Company sent Sir Thomas Dale to find a better base for its young colony. Dale headed upriver, locating a site that promised to be healthier and easier to defend. Plans for the city of Henricus, also known as Henrico or Henricopolis, were ambitious, with a hospital, library, and even a university included. Driving his more than 300 men relentlessly, Dale completed the new town in record time.
Henricus is a fortification, a refuge in 1612, peopled by artisans and soldiers. I remember reading in some of the Farah literature about the sale of this island to the Randolphs in 1727, and they talked about the great field of Henrico, and we're probably in it. And that great field had been created 3 acre by 3 acre by 3 acre for every tobacco crop from the 1612, 13, 14, all the way into the 18th century. So it was just cleared land as they went, as they farmed. And you could exhaust the soil in 3 crops, and by the 2nd crop, you're already cutting new land to put in tobacco. So that's how that great field came about. And that's an interesting glimpse of how much this land got worked. So it slowly develops from the fortification, the place in the woods that's a frontier culture, to a farm in the frontier. And then, of course, there's an interruption in the uprising in 1622, and then it comes back in the 1630s. As a tobacco farm called Farah's Island, which it's still called.
Henricus revived the fortunes of Virginia, at least temporarily. John Rolfe developed a profitable tobacco, giving the colony a much-needed cash crop. Prosperity was not swift, however, and familiar problems like disease and hunger returned.
There were periods when the morale was so low, and the word got back to London that the whole colony was dying. This is particularly true after the starving time of 1609, but they very nearly gave up. But then the investors, the businessmen, said, well, we've got this much in it. Why not just try a little more? And so they rounded up more people and sent them out. But then most of these people weren't people who really wanted to be colonists. They wanted to get away.
It's a rural society transported. They're earthy people. Their lives are somewhat the way they would be at home, with some rough edges made by the new world, if you want to call it that they're living in. But if you go to most any subset of our society today that's rural and agricultural, it can be a lot of fun. There's a good sense of humor. There's a value in hard work and good work and successful work. And then there's some leisure. So they did some dancing and singing, and they enjoyed going to church. They enjoyed observing the wildlife around them. Some were fascinated with the other people who had been here for so long. Carefully fascinated, I hope, because there was a period of peace when Pocahontas, or Rebecca, was alive as the master's wife, John Rolfe's wife.
The peace following the marriage of Rolfe and Pocahontas would not last. With the arrival of each new settler, Henricus clearly indicated English determination to make a permanent foothold in America.
You had these group of colonists who came over, they set up shop, they're going to take over the world, that's their plan. And that's just like all of humanity, that's what they do. They want it, they're going to take it. And they'll take it by force if they have to. And that's exactly what the colonists did. You know, originally the natives were not hostile, historically speaking. Now, of course, whose history is this? But, you know, they were a little wary, of course. I mean, you have these people show up on your coastline, and you're kind of looking at them going, okay, what is that? So yes, they were wary about it and probably a little afraid. But then when you have these colonists who decide, we want what you have, and we're going to take it, and you're going to give it to us, or we will kill you for it. And that's what has happened in history the world over.
The colonists came with great aspirations and quickly found this wasn't El Dorado. This was not Eden. They were not acclimatized. They didn't like the weather. We still often don't like the weather. And they proceeded to die by the hundred. They had to get along with the Indians in their way. And their way meant the Christian way, which meant that the Indians were savages.
We're very fortunate that the English kept good documents and were able to give firsthand accounts of what really did happen. Unfortunately, with the village of Arrowhatack, or the tribe of Arrowhatack, not much is written after the English settled here in 1611. From what we kind of gather, they either dispersed the Arrowhatacks, who probably moved further upriver, or they possibly wiped them out. We don't know for sure. We know that Dale, Thomas Dale, when he did come up into the area, was very interested in kind of moving them a little bit further away. It would be a better defense tactic for him. But the English and the Indians, there were plenty of times of peace and war. You can't really say whether or not it was all good or all bad. We know that several tribes were very friendly with them, as well as some tribes were extremely aggressive with the English as well.
An interesting part of the history of Henricus is that the individuals who first came here were primarily soldiers. Unlike at Jamestown, where there were many gentlemen there, these people came here, about 300 of them, after fighting in Europe. And they came heavily armed with many of the types of things that you see here. The site was settled in very quick order. The Palisades behind us and the towers and different things like that were built. It was a very defensible site against Spaniards and against Native Americans. So everyone here between the ages of 16 and 60 would have been part of the militia.
And they did a lot of fortifying. Dutch Gap, in fact, is a fortification from river to river on this island. It's a wall, and in front of it, essentially, they dig a large moat so that you'd have trouble getting to it. And there's 2 miles, from what I understand in the record, between the fortification, the little place Henricus, and that. So that 2 miles was meant to be used and probably became cropland over time. And they did other things like that. And most of their little villages are palisaded. They look from the river, I imagine, somewhat like an Indian village at first. And so they begin slowly but surely opening up the land. And it's huge and dark, so they don't get very far. I like to joke sometimes that when we talk about 1611 Henricus, it's the farthest west the English have ever come in Virginia. And just imagine that. There's nothing western about this place.
Survival on the frontier often depended on rigid discipline and extreme measures, ruthlessly enforced. Henricus, the western edge of English expansion, posed a lingering threat to the Powhatan chiefdom.
During this period of time, there's still very much different levels of authority and social status, from the knight Sir Thomas Dale as the High Marshal, still lower in rank than the governor, Lord Delaware, and then the various military ranks, and then the artisans and tradesmen doing the specialized labor, and then the common laborers. And each had their place, and didn't really occur to them to challenge that. That was the way the world was.
You work for the company. You're part of the union. And so you don't have much freedom, but everything you do is governed by the officers.
The company took complete control of the government of the colony. They did away with the elections. They wrote up a pamphlet called The Laws Divine, Moral, and Martial. and they were in effect from 1610 until 1619. They governed every aspect of your life, from when you woke up, what you did during the day, whether you were on a labor detail or military duty, to the point of how high off the ground to build your bed.
Earlier settlements had not been successful or as successful because oftentimes people didn't follow simple rules of survival, which might have to do with sharing food or hoarding food, which would be something you could be punished for, or how you would go outside of the fort, whether if you would be, it was required that you would wear armor to protect yourself. So people who didn't follow the rules not only risked their own lives, but they risked the lives of everyone here. So these laws were very harsh, but they were meant ideally to protect everyone. Things like, like coming to church was also a way to make sure that someone was still around and still there, who had come in from maybe a farm a distance away. To be involved in the militia on a daily basis made sure that people were always ready with their weapons, and it also it allowed the Native Americans to view that these people were a warlike people and could defend themselves, and that was important to be able to do that.
Disaster came to Henricus, despite the martial preparations of its inhabitants. In 1622, Chief Opikankanu coordinated a devastating attack against the English settlements throughout the colony. Hundreds died and Henricus burned. The Virginia Company dissolved, ceding control of the colony to the Crown. To the dismay of the Powhatan Indians, however, English settlers were not deterred from coming to Virginia.
We're going to live this way for now. And once we find all that money and all those riches and we, take what we need, then we'll be able to change. So shortly, as it sort of evolved, of course, old social customs from England came back into practice, and more people started coming over. And then what you have is your second wave of immigrants, and they are largely the second and third sons of the Virginia gentry, of the English gentry, who now have come to Virginia, and they're going to set up shop here. So pretty much it's kind of, someone came and tested it all for them to see what to do, how to do what you need, how to live. And then, these second and third sons came. They were given crown grants of land. They were established in politics. They had a direct tie. They considered themselves to be English. They did not consider themselves to be Virginians or Americans in any sense of the word. They were just an extension of England.
The question of what you've had before has to be balanced with what you have now. So for the man who came from a tenement, a 20-foot house with a real roof over it of his own was as good as a palace. But a small house with 2 rooms for a man who roamed around a castle, this just really didn't make it. So it isn't possible to say this is the way it was for them, because there were various levels of them, levels of expectation and levels of remembrance.
If you live in a log fortress, so to speak, you're kind of hacking out your life. You're trying to figure out where you're going, what you're doing. Obviously they were concerned about being invaded, whether it's the native populace or just something in their own imaginations. They were nervous.
You come here and you're a small select group. You've left a lot of people at home. Even the English holidays are not celebrated here unless someone does decide to do it. So your whole culture is sort of left behind until you make it. So my guess is holidays like Christmastide that week were just grasped with great intensity because that was home. Just like we do today. It was nostalgia. But at the same time, they knew they had this huge land, huger than they even knew, and they were going to make something of it.
Living in a palisaded fort was not what they did in England, and they certainly weren't going to do it over here, but so long. You don't have a permanent village, town, whatever, unless you've got the whole culture here, and that's what the women brought over. And besides, we got to do some of the chores that the men were having to do that they wouldn't have normally done, so they were glad to have us. Well, the women didn't come over here until, about 1619, and they came over on the bride ships. And when I start talking about how the women got here, that really blows everybody's mind, because I'll tell them that a farmer tobacco farmer who was doing real well and probably had 150 pounds of excess tobacco, bought a wife. And you can imagine, I have a lot of the school groups come out, you can imagine what those young girls do when I say they bought a wife. You know, not going to be bought, you know, this is not what we do today. But when you explain that you can stay in England and do the same thing that you've done every day of your life until you die, or you can come to the New World and marry a man who owns land and might make some money, then they change their minds.
The optimism, hope, and tenacity of the first Virginia settlers helped England secure a permanent presence in the Americas. 4 centuries later, their spirit endures.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.